Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hi, this is Henry Gilroy, co-executive producer of Star Wars Rebels. You're listening to Aggressive Negotiations.
Welcome to Aggressive Negotiations, the podcast that gets done in 12 parsecs or more every single week. I'm one of your hosts, Jedi Master John Mills, and with me as always is the calm, rational, and cool, collected Jedi Master, Matthew Rushing. Matt, how are you today?
Wow, I guess nobody caught the rant before we started. I'm just kidding.
Well, that's how you stay so calm, cool, and collected on the show, is that you let all of the rage out in the Sith side of the room. And
exactly.
Well.
We do have a Sith side of the room. We have a Jedi side of the room. When we record, we try to be on the Jedi side of the room.
Yeah, it's sort of like did the Jedi Temple have like a Sith corner? Like if you sent somebody to time out, was it like you sent them to Sith out or something? That'd be kind of interesting.
I'm pretty sure they just called that the Mace Windu quarter.
Yeah, that would make sense.
So, you can just see
makes sense.
him needing to smash some things.
Oh, yeah, I could see it. It's good to get it out there. And also it's good to get out there that thenerdparty.com is where you can find us. thenerdparty.com/contact is where you can drop a line to us. You can find the show on Twitter at The Jedi Masters. You can find the network at Join Nerd Party. Use the hashtag Aggressive Negotiations if you would, very kindly. You can find the Nerd Party on Instagram and Facebook simply as The Nerd Party. So those are channels by which you can make contact with the two of us who fancy ourselves Jedi Masters. And, of course, you can always leave a review and rating for us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, whatever name it's going by right now. And so we actually did, Matt, get a new review. And as promised, we always read our reviews. If you are thoughtful enough to leave a written review for us on iTunes, we are happy to read it on air. And this one is a 3-star review from iTunes called that the title is Thoughtful but Sometimes Hard to Enjoy. And it says, this is a great podcast in terms of thought-provoking topics and really well-articulated theories. It's a wonderful, wonderful sentiment. Thank you. Especially in terms of the Force, and they are great for all of the books. Any book episodes, there is probably nobody better. It's a tremendous compliment. But
so they're saying that nobody does it better.
Yes. A reference to one of the 5 best Bond movies. But occasionally, I have a hard time listening to them talk about, quote, if I was in the writer's room, end quote, that they would have done this or that. They sound like they are serious. Nothing against them, but I sometimes can't listen when it spirals down that path. The tone of it makes me wonder if they actually enjoy wars at all. Well, again, Miles, who left that review, thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time to leave that review. Certainly. I hope that at some point in the future we can earn those remaining 2 stars on the iTunes review. And I can tell you, to speak to your point, I think that when we are talking about things that we would have changed at the concept stage or edits that we would have made to one of the films or one of the episodes or whatever, I know that I am serious. I don't use that in a dire or dour sort of tone, but even with the things that we love, Matt and I are serious, and we do love Star Wars. But if occasionally when you cast a critical eye on something, you certainly do see something that maybe could have worked a little bit better. Everybody has their opinions about stuff, and I can certainly tell you that any criticism that we've ever offered has always been thoughtful. So serious in terms of thoughtful, absolutely. And again, we hope that in the near future, we can earn those remaining 2 stars. But thank you very much for listening. We do appreciate it.
Well, that's just one of those things, too. George Lucas is definitely of the school that art is never truly finished. It just has to be abandoned,
right.
Because you've got to get it out there sometime. And so, even the maker himself was never always fully pleased with his own work. And so, part of being fans is for us, getting to talk about those things, and we never do it as I don't think disrespectful to the creators themselves. It's just our personal opinion, and in the end, like everybody is free to have their own opinion.
Yeah, and it's funny you talk about everybody has their own opinion. That ties into everybody has their own point of view, and this is one of our trademark surprise episodes. I didn't tell Matt what was tickling my brain. But it was something that I'm reading a book right now that, Matt, I know you have read, by James Papandrea called From Star Wars to Superman. And I just finished the chapter where he talks about Star Wars. And I enjoyed it. I disagreed with some of his interpretations. And specifically, one of the things that stuck out to me is I think one of the questions that's never been settled and never will be settled among fans, but it's a question I want to ask you, is has there been too much hay made about the statement that Obi-Wan utters to Luke, saying that many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view? A lot of people have taken that to mean that Obi-Wan is advocating moral relativism. And I wanted to open up a discussion about this because I'll flat out say I don't agree with that interpretation, but I wanted to just sort of kick off a discussion about this because I think this is one of the most discussed sentences in all of the Star Wars media.
Yeah, I would agree with that idea that this is probably one of the things that gets tossed around the most. It's probably a line that also gets tossed out the most, as a way of kind of putting Obi-Wan up there, especially with his line about, absolutes as well. I think those may be the two most quoted Obi-Wan lines when talking about where Obi-Wan comes from, moralistically and those kind of things. I never took that line as that way, in the sense that it means that, that what you believe isn't true, and that you just by looking at it from a different point of view, that, you could completely and totally and utterly change things. But what I do think that Obi-Wan is trying to say to Luke is that you have a perspective now, but life, time, and experience helps you broaden that perspective. And so, specifically, the conversation where that happens, Luke is saying, it's such a long way from here, and Obi-Wan says, that's your uncle talking, and Owen has a very strict perspective of what happened. His worry that Luke is going to go down, the path that Vader did. As Obi-Wan says, fall old Obi-Wan on some damnful idealistic crusade that's going to get his nephew killed. And so he has a very strict perspective, which he, Uncle Owen is very unwilling to deviate from whatsoever. And I think what Obi-Wan is trying to say to Luke in that moment is that you need to be open to the idea that you could be wrong, and your ideas do need to be tested by looking at things from a certain point of view, a different point of view, putting yourself in other people's shoes, those kind of things. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what you do believe will end up being wrong in the end. But it should be tested. We shouldn't live untested lives. And I always believed that's really what he was trying to say to Luke in that moment. And the way that he says it is just an economical phrase to get that point across, which George is, with his dialogue, especially in the original trilogy, is very economical in the way that he uses language. And it's an interesting and wonderful kind of turn of phrase as well. So it does really stick with you. But I never took it as being something that was that Obi-Wan meant that there were no absolute truth whatsoever in the universe. That it just only mattered about your perspective and Does that make any sense?
It does, because I think that sort of going along with that, it was disorienting being somebody who has grown up with the Star Wars films from the get-go. I haven't known life without Star Wars dominating culture in some fashion, except for that brief period between, I'd say, 85 to 87. Very brief breather that we all had on that. But I think that to go along with that, I think that there is a default setting, I think, maybe in people's brains where when they hear the word truth in that sentence, they're capitalizing the word truth. Many of the truths, capital T, that we cling to, which speaks to your point about absolute truths. There are good, and there's good, there's evil, there's good, there's bad. Even Palpatine, Sidious says, the dark side of the Force, and Luke refers to the light, and we know that light means good. Light is a positive thing. Light is enlightenment. And I think that the key is to view truth in that sentence with a lowercase t, because he's speaking specifically about, I think the word truth, to speak to your point about, it meaning the conclusions we reach, is Obi-Wan is laying on Luke there at that moment that Anakin was dead to me and Vader replaced him. So yes, Vader did kill your father because the man I loved didn't exist anymore. But now that you're old enough and able to handle this truth, I can give you the full story. And so I think that, as boring as it might be for us to be in agreement on this, I think that it's always been one of those things where it still rankles me, because the Jedi do stand in this, larger story for truth. It's like saying that, Superman doesn't really stand for anything. It's like, well, yeah, he does. And the Jedi stand for something too. And those have to be regarded as truths with a capital T. And so it's, why do you think that it is? And you know what? I don't want to ask why you think that it is. I want to ask, is it possible that the two of us are viewing it in a less interesting way, and that it's simply not less interesting because it's wrong, but that people have mined that specific sentence because it gives them interesting spin-off story possibilities for them to glom onto?
I do think that, especially, we talked about last week, some of the surprises about the Phantom Menace. And, I think that before we had any kind of idea of the Jedi, I think that created a lot of maybe story possibilities for people in their minds, of what the Jedi were like. And I think it's an interesting statement too, because I think that when Obi-Wan makes that statement, especially now in light of the prequels, Obi-Wan can see how the Jedi had turned small t truths into large capitalized T truths, and that had hurt the Jedi Order. And so in many ways, Obi-Wan recognizes that you have to keep the main thing. And so there are many truths that we hold that do need to be seen from a different point of view, right? Like you were talking about, these lowercase t truths. But then there are those that we cannot abandon, which I think we would all agree the Jedi definitely believe in a right and a wrong and all of those kind of things that they would uphold in every civilization on every planet and all those kind of things. And yet Obi-Wan has seen the problem of taking, small t truths, things that may possibly be true for, half the people, in the sense of like that would be the best thing for this person, but not for that person. And I think maybe he's even thinking specifically of Anakin in that moment when he's thinking, you know what, maybe if we hadn't have been so dogmatic and he had been allowed to marry, this would have never happened, because that was a small T truth that we turned into a capitalized T truth, and it hurt the chosen one.
Well, yeah,
because we weren't. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah. Well,
so
and not even just the marriage thing, but the fact that the Jedi eschewed attachment and love and those sorts of, and we've talked about that, where Anakin is right in the moment where he's, we're trained to be compassionate, and that is love, and that is attachment that's forbidden, and those sorts of things. And it sort of triggers for me, though, because you mentioned Anakin and the confusion of the truths and point of view. And Anakin even says on Mustafar, from my point of view, the Jedi are evil. At what point do you think that Anakin is Vader, came to the conclusion that Palpatine, and this isn't just a simple question about realizing he was manipulated. I think he always kind of knew that. But because he enters into the devil's bargain with Palpatine fully knowing that he's doing bad stuff, but for his own personal gain. But at what point do you think that there was that moment where Vader realized, wow, it's not that the Sith and Sidious reached different conclusions than the Jedi. They reached the same ones and said, nah, don't care. Still going to do it our way.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. The Jedi and the Sith have different absolutes that they absolutely hold to. And for the Jedi, it's selflessness, and for the Sith, it's selfishness. And part of that comes from the Jedi eschewing that life is all there is, in the sense that this life that we are in now. It's why Yoda says, for those that are lost, mourn for them, do not. Miss them, do not. Because they are now one with the Force. And so they have a bigger understanding of existence than just the here and now. They think about the ramifications of the whole. And that's what creates that selfless nature in them. And I think so we see these two groups which have wildly different interpretations on what's actually important in the here and now, based on the fact that one only lives in the here and now, and the other, because they are trying to grasp onto immortality of living forever through the here and now, and the others which are willing to lay down their lives because they believe in the greater purpose of the entire universe as a whole. So, I think that kind of comes down to where Anakin finds the side that's going to give him what he wants, the thing that he...
Sure, well, sure, but I mean, like, do you think there was a moment where Vader was forced to realize that it's not that Palpatine reached a different conclusion or a different truth than the Jedi? That the Sith didn't say the Jedi were wrong about what they were doing or anything. They just said they didn't care. And so do you think there was some horrifying moment where Vader... Do you think it was when Vader first came off the table, where he realized when Padme was dead that there was, that the whole thing... the Jedi were right, and Palpatine knew they were right, and he just didn't care. Palpatine never says the Jedi are wrong. He just doesn't want to do it that way. And so so basically there's a moment of truth where Anakin / Vader comes at it and says, oh my gosh, he knew I was on the right path, and he pulled me off it anyway, just because... He's just a person who doesn't want to do it that way. He just doesn't want to follow that path.
I mean, I do think that there is that realization in the moment when he is told that Padme is dead, and he screams no. That because he realizes that he sealed his fate, And now the only choice that he feels that he has left is to fully embrace the fate that he's chosen, which is this evil, this hatred, to keep him going, because otherwise it would be too painful to... And I think we've seen that, when we talked about the Darth Vader comics and some of the places where you remember when he was making his lightsaber?
Right.
And he was tempted by the light side, and he had to destroy that vision of if he had chosen correctly.
Right.
And he had to embrace the hatred. And so I do think that there is that moment.
But I just think that I think that there is a fundamental aspect of Palpatine in that he doesn't think the Jedi are wrong per se. He just rejects it. He knows what the truth of everything is, and he just tosses it aside. And so I think that there is that aspect to him, and maybe Obi-Wan's statement speaks to that as well. But that actually sort of triggers something for me as well, and it's something I've never been able to fully resolve. But Vader would have been able, don't you think, to end his existence in light of everything that happened. Why do you think it's purely the fear of death that keeps Vader going, or is there something else integral to that switch that keeps him from turning the blade on himself, as it were?
I just don't think he feels like... I don't know if I ever thought of Vader ever having that thought. And part of that was because it would have been too painful a thought in the first place. And I think what I was saying earlier, where he embraces anger, I think the anger chases away any of those type of thoughts for the longest time. Again, I think he faces down some of those demons in the sense, and he fully embraces the dark side, and that allows him to not be able to not have to have those kind of thoughts, not to be introspective like that anymore. He becomes the, what we saw and what we think of in, episode 4 is this monstrous half man, half machine killing machine, right? And so I think that died in Anakin. I think that part of him died. And I think we see that in those Darth Vader comics, those times when there was a possibility for him to even have those thoughts. And I think after that, I don't think he even has the ability to really have them, because he's so fully embraced in the hate and the death of the dark side. And he won't have those awoken in him. The Force will not awaken in him again in that way until he, is faced with Luke. And so, yeah, I don't know. Did you ever picture him having those moments? Or
yeah, I would think it would be natural. I do think that anger could keep somebody going. I think fear could keep somebody going. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and he hates himself and all of those sorts of things. And it's just something where I've just always pondered, was it possible that he had those thoughts at some point? Or maybe they came and they went, sort of thing. Maybe Palpatine keeps Vader so busy that he can't slow down enough to have those sorts of thoughts. Like maybe the introspection is kept away from Vader. I mean, we see him in a meditation chamber when he's at a point where he's supposed to be ready finally to overthrow Palpatine and take over the galaxy for himself. But I've always gone back and forth in my head as to whether Vader would have ever been at a point like that, and whether something would have spoken to him to keep him alive beyond the fear. It might. Valid answer could just be that the fear of death kept him going. And maybe.
Well, I think kind of all the way back to what you were saying, there with the certain point of view and this whole idea, I think Vader becomes afraid to see anything from another point of view other than now Palpatine's point of view, the dark side's point of view, because that would lead him to that point, And what's interesting is I think see the way in which the Jedi and the Sith there became a little bit too much alike in that sense, where they were not seeing things from other perspectives. And so, and they weren't looking at things from any other perspective. And I think that becomes one of the major downfalls of the Jedi and why they fall, because they can't see a different point of view. But it's the same thing for the Sith. They can't see another point of view. And I think that's why the Empire only lasts, 30 years, because Palpatine can't see anybody beating him at this point. He can't see anybody being willing to lay down their lives for a free galaxy if they don't get to live in it, right? He just can't see that point of view, and therefore that's the thing. I think that Obi-Wan is therefore warning Luke about, which is you need to be careful that you don't get locked into. And doesn't Luke become that person again? Luke does that same thing when he looks at Ben in that hovel and thinks to himself, "No, there's no other way. There's no way this boy could be redeemed. I have to kill him," and he ignites his lightsaber, right? So I feel like we keep seeing this recurring theme happen of people not being able to truly learn this lesson of always seeing the possibilities and seeing things from a different point of view. And it's interesting. I think when you take what we've been talking about this whole time with the way that I take what Obi-Wan is saying, it might be one of the most important lessons of all of Star Wars that nobody seems to have learned yet, really.
Yeah, and I definitely think just bringing it back around to Vader one last time is I'm reminded of a book I read a long time ago called People of the Lie by M. Scott Peck, where Vader. And I think this ties into what I was, saying about Palpatine earlier. Palpatine, the Jedi view on existence, it works. I just don't care. Whereas another way for Vader to exist with what's happened is for him to willfully, it's almost like an Orwellian thing. He can keep two competing truths in his brain alive so long as he never brings them into conflict. And maybe that's the key with the point of view thing, is Vader is forced with Luke to take those two mutually exclusive thoughts, the double think, and he's forced to try to resolve it. And that's what brings about the the dissolution of the lie and the re-embrace of the truth. He just needed a different point of view to make those two exclusive things resolve themselves.
Well, and if you think about it, being somebody who is that kind of introspective, to which you are willing to take competing points of view and play them off against each other so you can test to see which one is right. That's a truly well-lived life. One that is an examined life, is a truly well-lived life. And I think, again, that's exactly what Obi-Wan is trying to say to Luke. If you live an unexamined life, you will end up living that life where you do just have two completely competing points of view, and you hold them both as truths, but they can't actually coexist. But you never see it. And honestly, I think we all do that. I think there are many examples in our world these days that you could see that everywhere of that happening. So I think what Obi-Wan is calling us to is to live a well-examined life, and therefore, when we think of the truths that we hold to, capital T and small t, those should be tested. And we need, the only way to do that is to examine what it is we believe, why we believe it, and those kind of things, and rightly orient our lives to where capital T's are actually capital T's, small t's are actually small t's, and the wisdom to know the difference, And I think, again, when I hear that phrase, it's interesting to me because, I think Obi-Wan has been much maligned for these kind of statements, right? And people just kind of like, Obi-Wan just seems kind of like a big liar, but I don't think that's it. I think he's much wiser than many people have given him credit for in the Star Wars universe. I think he may be one of the wisest characters that we have. He still makes him and Yoda both still even make their mistakes all the way to the end, right? But I do think this phrase that we were keying in on here really shows some intense wisdom, and that makes sense from a guy who spent 19 years in the desert communing with Qui-Gon Jinn, learning the ways of the Force in a way that Jedi, maybe even as old as Yoda, hadn't done in the longest time. And I think that's why we see two much wiser, smarter, more experienced men who have really benefited from their exile because they haven't spent it twiddling their thumbs. They've spent it in, it seems like, much introspection and trying to understand what went wrong and how to do it better next time.
Well, I think in light of the fact that we have seen a deleted scene where Yoda confesses to Luke that Obi-Wan wanted to tell Luke about the truth of his lineage, and Yoda told him no, and stopped him from doing it. The fact that it almost recasts that whole sentence the way that I think we are coming at it, where Obi-Wan is more or less just explaining this specific thing to Luke, as opposed to telling him that there is no solid ground on which to stand. So I almost wonder if it's removing that predicating context from the text of the film is what loosens it up in such a way that it's a valid interpretation. I could understand why somebody would come at it that way and see it that way. And there may even be people who still see it that way. And if they do, where can they find you online to discuss it?
Well, you can find me all over the place. I am MattRushing02 on Twitter and Instagram, Letterboxd, and Tumblr. You can find me all of those places. You can find me here on the network. I do another show. It's called Owlpost, and I do that with Drea Kaufman as we talk all about Harry Potter each and every week, one chapter at a time. I'm over on the Trek FM network doing a couple shows. One, Chris Jones, I do The Orb about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. We had our latest episode drop, so make sure you check that out. Our goal is to try and make those more regular, so hopefully you'll check that out. And you can find me doing the 602 Club with my co-host Christy Morris as we talk all about the fandoms we love. You never know which fandom we're going to be choosing, so make sure you check that out. And then last but not least, Cinema Stories is back for the year with my good friend Courtney as we talk all about films through the lens of faith. But John, maybe everybody would like to catch up with you and talk more about this idea. And where could they find you if they wanted to do that?
Oh, I doubt anybody would want to tussle about this with me, but I'm Kessel Junkie, KESSELJUNKIE. I lurk around on Twitter. You can find me on Letterboxd and Goodreads and writing the occasional article for Set the Tape. You can also find me right here on the network co-hosting a delightful little show called Retro Perspective with Mike Schindler, where we are marching through the calendar year 1994, one release week at a time, and looking back at the films that defined that important, pivotal year in recent film history. So, with all of that said, Matt, I think there's only one thing left to say. I think it's time to close negotiations.
John, negotiations are closed.
Join the revolution. Join the Nerd Party.